Hello BookTube. It's time for Poetry Tuesday, my oft-neglected regular feature on this channel where we look at live poetry, live in situ poetry, not something that's been fossilized in the canon, but something that's out there in the world trying to earn its way. And one of the places where I like to find live poetry is in periodicals that aren't devoted to it. Literary periodicals, political periodicals, they all, as a holdover from the 19th century and the Atlantic Monthly, they all feel behooved to have a poem or two. I don't think their readers would really miss them. The New Yorker does it. Everybody does it. And the New York Review of Books, I got the latest New York Review of Books, and they also include a couple of poems in every issue. So I thought we'd go through this and find a poem and read it together. But it also gives us a perfect chance to look at the New York Review of Books. I have already been through this to look for blurbs, Steve blurbs. I don't appear to have seen any, but I wanted to walk you through some of the interesting parts in it, just because you might not have your New York Review of Books yet. Like, for instance, the very first review is by Fred Kaplan, who we've just recently seen, right? The source of a rather embarrassing confusion of mine, where I wondered which Fred Kaplan is this to write a book about. He reviews a couple of books, one about and one by General Mathis, who just recently left the Trump White House, who resigned in protest and left the Trump White House, but has refused to say any of the details. It was obvious from his leaked resignation letter that he was resigning for reasons of principle and not because, he had a kidney operation or something like that. But he has refused to criticize Donald Trump publicly, and he's refused to explain why he resigned, saying that as a serving member of the military, his duty is to respect the commander-in-chief as long as the commander-in-chief is commander-in-chief. And this led to flatline sales for his book, Call Sign Chaos, because the only reason that anybody wants to read it is to read what he thinks of Donald Trump and what life was like for him in the Trump White House. And the minute that critics and then the reading public realized that he wasn't going to do that, they had no interest in his book. And not just for seedy tell-all. Mathis was considered to be, quote-unquote, one of the adults in the room. And that perspective is valuable. And his critics, among whom I number myself, have said that he does far greater disservice to his country than he's ever done in what is a long and illustrious career by not speaking out about this president, who is an existential threat to the country, who wants to make this a dictatorship, who calls the generals of the army his generals, and who toys with the idea of... You know the rap sheet. And I was happy to see that Fred Kaplan takes Mathis to task for that. He says Mathis is too smart not to know that he's trying to have it both ways. If he truly wanted to remain apolitical, he shouldn't have resigned in protest. If he really were averse to adding his own criticism to the cacophony, he shouldn't have admitted to harboring critical thoughts. Nor should he have told Goldberg, the author of one of the books, as if teasing a pending sequel to his memoir, that his period of silence is not eternal, that he might speak out at some point. I agree completely. I read his book. It's not only boring, but sniveling, which is unbelievable to say about a four-star general who has nothing to prove to anyone. Nevertheless, I thought the review pleased me, because ordinarily not ordinarily, I shouldn't say ordinarily, but sometimes the New York Review of Books can be rather namby-pamby in its book criticism. Sometimes they don't like to lay around with haymakers. A perfect example of that would be Alan Hollinghurst, who's I consider one of the greatest novelists working today, who reviewed The Grammarians by Kathleen Sheen, which is absolutely wretched book, even by her standards. She, of course, is the author of, among other things, the very worst novel ever written in the history of novels. The Grammarians is absolutely terrible, and it at its heart is one of the silly rinky-dink contrivances that are the reason why I am so quick to make fun of the made-up stories. It's twins. Good Lord, it's twins. and yet Hollinghurst, he palavers on for 3,000 words about how great she is and how great the book is. Utterly ridiculous, just utterly ridiculous. But you take the good with the bad when you get to the New York Review of Books. We have Emily Raboteau reviews a couple of books on climate change and its racist implications, the racial implications of climate change and the responses to climate change. Pretty fascinating subject that had the reviewer mentions somewhere in the review, I'm losing it now because it's a long piece, but the reviewer mentions a point that that has driven me crazy for years, which is that people will have their whole neighborhood devastated by a hurricane on the coast of America. They'll get federal relief funds to rebuild, and they'll rebuild right where they were. And if you news programs will go and interview these idiots, and they'll say, "Oh, we're not going to let a storm push us out of here." Like a storm is human, and we'll get the lesson that, I better pick on someone else. It's just totally stupid. Then Jonathan Stevenson does a piece on the rise of white supremacist paramilitary groups in America. And it's a perfect example of what I'm talking about the namby-pamby, mushy-mouthed, non-judgmental tone of articles in the New York Review, even on things where a judgment call is self-evident, where you're not going out on a limb at all. For instance, the ending of the piece, where he says, let's see here, it would appear that the second new global terrorism challenge in 20 years is now upon us, and that President Trump bears at least some responsibility for encouraging it. Who benefits from that kind of mush-mouth equivocation? Donald Trump actively encourages it. It's not some measure. He actively encourages these people. So again, you already know the lecture, but that drives me nuts. Who is benefiting from that except the bad guys? When you don't call a spade like that, who is benefiting from your equivocation other than bad people? Anyway, we'll progress on here. There was another article that bugged me, and I know that's what you're interested in. Oh yes, Tim Flannery, a really good writer on nature and natural sciences, reviews a book that we saw on this channel, Jacob Schell's book, Giants of the Monsoon Forest. It's about living and working with elephants in India. And Tim Flannery is way too generous. He's clueless to the point of being disingenuous, and that drives me nuts. Where is it that he has here? There was let's see here. Yeah, some aspects of the conditions under which working elephants live challenge Schell's view that the human-elephant relationship is a generally positive one. That was my main problem with the book, is that is the author's opinion, that slavery is a mainly positive relationship. It often begins with a brutal capture in which a calf is separated from its family. Then come months of training during which the captive is tied to a tree in the forest while a carrot and stick approach is used to teach it to behave. Details of the domestication process vary. Some elephants bear scars on their foreheads from machete blows, but far gentler means are employed in logging camps in Myanmar, where Schell made most of his observations. Some gentler. But there's another line that he uses that is just unbelievable. Even after their initial training, working elephants are not entirely free. I'm not finding the exact line, but the exact line mentions slavery and says that the relationship seems almost like slavery. These elephants who are forced to do things by a driver who has a hook in his hand called an ankus. If you've never seen one, you could Google it. You take a look at it and you'll realize immediately what it's for. It's for a human on the neck of an elephant. The ankus is long enough and it's viciously pointed hook at the end, so you can hook it inside the elephant's ear to chastise them, to discipline them. I'm not finding the... while acknowledging that elephants can suffer at human hands, Schell believes that the relationship that has helped Asian elephants and the humans who work with them to survive in the modern world. And again, this is soft pedaling a subject that deserves hammer blows. And that drives me nuts. These elephants are tortured, they are tormented, they are taken from their family. This is one of the most intensely social species in the world. They are worked when they don't want to work. They are chained, they are starved, they are beaten, they are whipped, they are kicked, they are gouged. All because, I don't even know, because the Mahout's grandfather and great-grandfather did it too. The ultimate argument of the book is one that is echoed by Tim Flannery, which is that at least these elephants get, 3 square meals and a cot, basically. That at least these domesticated is the word that he keeps using, and same thing with Jacob Schell, he uses it too. They're enslaved. They're not domesticated. They're enslaved. They're not working elephants. They're slave elephants. And the reasoning here is that at least they are protected for their work. They're valued for the work they can do, so they're not hunted. They're not exterminated. Whereas their wild counterparts are in danger from deforestation, from land appropriation, and from simple, humans killing them for crop degradation. That is a horrible idea. I have heard it before. We've all heard it before. It was the idea that was most often presented to the abolitionist movement, trying to get rid of American slavery. The proponents saying, look, I got nothing. I got no dog in the race. I'm not in favor of slavery, but if you let all these people go, don't have any skills, what's going to happen then? They're better off where they are. At least they're being taken care of. Sure, occasionally it can be a little brutal. Sure, occasionally, small children are taken away from their parents, but at least they're alive. It's getting me blood boiling right now, so let's just move on. Oh, that kind of, if you want to call it reasoning, didn't apply then, doesn't apply now, never applies. That kind of moral geometry of ends justifying means is loathsome. Absolutely loathsome. It would be loathsome even with animals who weren't as advanced as elephants are. Elephants live as long as humans. They think as good as humans. They feel as profoundly as humans do. They reflect on themselves and others in just the way that humans do. They don't have hands. They have a language. They have a culture, but they don't have hands. Anyway, Max Rodenbeck does a nice long review of that book by Tim McIntosh Smith, Arabs, A 3,000-Year History. I was very happy to see that, and I liked the review. It was very detailed. It points out some of the things that are missing in the book, and points out also that even in a book that size, you're going to miss something in a 3,000-year history. But this is exactly the kind of example of a review that I will pull out of this book review, fold up, and put in the book. So that I have it. I know exactly where to find it. I thought there was one other noteworthy thing in here before we go on to the poem. I don't know what you're going to make of the poem or the poet. The poet is well known to me. I thought there was one more thing I wanted to talk to you about. Oh, no, there isn't. There's an essay about the betrayal of the Kurds, but the less said about that, the better. It's just so disgraceful. It's so disgraceful. Oh, no, yes, we go. Zadie Smith, the great Zadie Smith, does a review of a book called Self-Portrait by Celia Paul. And the minute I saw that name, I thought, oh, I'd never heard of this book, Self-Portrait by Celia Paul. But Celia Paul, I know all about now because I just finished reading William Fever's big biography of Lucian Freud, who was her lover. And her colleague and inspiration and compatriot and gadfly for decades. And she's all over that book. So it felt like I was reading about someone that I knew all about, when actually I don't. I only know, the only thing I know about her is from that book. But anyway, let's go to the poem for our Poetry Tuesday. It's one of the 2 poems in this. This one is by a famous poet, a lauded poet, probably one of our most lauded poets today, Frederick Seidel, who I don't know how many of you will know his name. He is his most commercially viable book, the one that got the widest amount of press and distribution, was a book called Ooga Booga. But he has written lots and lots of poetry. And he's a bit of an acquired taste. Some of his poems, when I first was introduced to him 15 years ago, I thought were gobbledygook. And I have continued to read him, and the more I've read him, the more I sort of start to get him, and the more I like him. And I'm wondering how much of that will be apparent. I don't know how many of you, be sure to sound out in the comments field if you know this poet and like him. But those of you who don't know him, well, I'm wondering what your initial impressions will be. And I don't know how good a job I'm going to do reading. Again, I apologize for my poetry reading ability. But the title of the poem is Moxifloxacin. And that's a medication. Moxifloxacin is a medication. And here is the poem. And again, I will leave the text down below so that we can read it together, and you can tell me what you think of it. I learn a lot from these Poetry Tuesdays. Although I'd like to say, I mean, it's egotistical, and probably not true, but I'd like to say that I can probably get Frederick Seidel on my own. I very much like this poet now. I have come to very much like him. I look forward to seeing a poem of his. And he's in journals like this, in places where poetry you don't expect to find it. He's in the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books all the time. So anyway, here's the poem. And I'm not going to try and read it like him. He reads his poems deadly flat and earnest. And I don't know that I'm going to be able to do that. And I won't mimic his inflections. I will do my best not to. I know down from up, and this ain't up. The street flows like an ice flow down the street. Buildings on either side bow from the waist mockingly, mocking me. A center strip of green, which for some reason they call a mall, divides uptown and downtown traffic from each other, going north and going south from each other. I'm talking to the sky, which doesn't hear me, of course, because of the traffic noise or whatever. Never mind the ice flow. I'm thinking about how hot it is. I'm thinking about the wonderful Laure de Gourcuff, whom many years ago I was almost in love with, pronounced de Gourkoof. I want to say something extreme. She was as quiet as a leaf. I want to say something intense. How peculiar to have pneumonia in this heat, which I've just learned I have. A patch 1 inch square that CT scan detected inspires the use of antibiotic metatonnage to wipe the inflammation off the face of the earth. You're printed on my lung, darling, and on my mind. I am getting young. So many years have passed. It's as if I were making it up. There we were, down in the Cher, at their ugly chateau the size of an apartment building. Oh, my pneumonia. You and I are about to take a big plane to England. Do I need permission from my Moxifloxacin? I just said to my girlfriend, whom I will see in London, I said, is that a nice way to talk on Father's Day to New York? To the 4 wheels of your car, the steering wheel of your life, the horn that honks you? So, those of you who have never heard of this poet before, welcome to the world of Frederick Seidel. The poems are weird. They are weird. But they are not self-indulgently and formlessly weird in the way of their beat templates, I would argue, at all. I would argue there's a tremendous amount of thought and structure in something like this. A tremendous amount of it. Now, on the surface, one of the signature characteristics of a Frederick Seidel poem, most of the ones that I've read, I'm not an expert on this poet by any means, I'm only telling you my impressions of him having, I energetically read him now. And one of the impressions you get on the surface is that the poem starts out about something and then just sort of slides off the table. And it still has its form, like a slinky. It still has its form, but the form has now slid off the table and is sort of sliding into places that you didn't expect. So the poem starts off with the poet being a little bit disoriented due to the medication that he's taking for pneumonia, which has a slight disorienting effect. So we have, I know down from up, and this ain't up. And then the great line, the street flows like an ice flow down the street. That's terrific. Buildings on either side bow mockingly from the waist. That is meant to, I think, is meant to sort of represent on the page the kind of slightly off feeling you have, not only as a result of a disturbing diagnosis, you've got a little spot of bother on your CT scan, you've got a little pneumonia, that can be very serious, but also the medication that you take to combat it, the metatonnage of medication that you're taking to wipe it off the face of the earth. That those two things together can create a sense of disorientation. I think we get that in the first stanza. Although when I write the poem down below and you read it, you will see there are all sorts of explicit and buried rhymes all throughout here. This is a poet, in my opinion, who loves to play with rhymes, winding them all around. It's not just the obvious ones. They're winding in and around and back on themselves all through the poem. in ways that I'm going to run the risk here and call it playful. Even though if you ever hear Frederick Seidel recite one of his own poems, playful will not come to your mind. Nevertheless, I think these are a perfect combination of very smart and very playful. And as usual, the poem then flows off the table. It starts out being about the title and about the disorientation, and then it becomes about something else. It becomes about, you've got this thing inside you, these things inside you, both the medical trouble and the medicine, and you're traveling with both of them. And is the medication going to allow you to travel? And is even saying the medication a little bit unseemly in mixed company? I just love it. There are parts of it, of course, that I don't understand. I don't understand the line, "I'm getting young." I don't get some of the things that are going on in here. I imagine I'll be rereading this poem for a long time. It will show up in the next collected Frederick Seidel. I'll read it again then, and maybe a couple of other times. But I believe that he knows what's going on in this poem. And I don't always get that feeling with modern poetry. A little bit odd to call Frederick Seidel modern poetry, but you know what I mean. He's alive and he's working. He's getting checks in the mail from his poems. So I'm considering him a modern poet. He's a working, living poet. And unlike with a lot of such poets, where I get the impression that the simple word association has just caused them to wander off into wherever, and then they end that way and just pause expectantly for applause. With Seidel, I get the impression that he does know what he's doing from every line, every moment, every. I don't know if you probably couldn't tell from my terrible reading, but this, like so many of Seidel's poems, this poem breathes, and it's not just the breaks in stanza. It actually has a breathing movement of its own that is dictated by line length and by some of those buried rhymes. It doesn't have anything to do with the breaks in stanza. The poem breathes on its own. And I like that as well, especially in a poem that is at least on one level about pneumonia. So that is Moxifloxacin. That is a Frederick Seidel poem. I've never talked about him on this channel before. I'll be fascinated to know what you make of all that. I will write the poem down below. We had a brief question on this channel whether or not that flew in the face of copyright or fair usage. I don't think anybody would mind. I don't think a poet's going to mind, especially since if you like this poem, and if you like this poet, I will strongly encourage you to go out and buy a book or many books. There's a big fat collected Frederick Seidel that is well worth your time if you like this. And how many other poems have we seen that, right? We've had other poets where some of them couldn't get enough of them. And I believe that poets would like that. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now. That is Poetry Tuesday. And who knows where we'll go next time. So I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.